Welcome. Tonight, we journey back to a land both familiar and endlessly mysterious. Ancient Egypt. When you think of Egypt, perhaps your mind drifts immediately to golden pyramids rising against a pale horizon, to temples carved with hieroglyphs, to the serene face of the Sphinx. These images linger in popular imagination as symbols of majesty, wonder, and eternal endurance. Yet beneath the grandeur lies another story, quieter, harsher, and deeply human. Behind every monument of stone, there were men and women whose lives were spent in toil. Behind every glittering treasure, there was a cost, often paid in sweat and years. The pyramids did not build themselves, and the pharaohs, who ruled as living gods, depended upon countless unseen hands. Over the course of this journey, we will step gently into 4 chapters of Egyptian history. First, we will descend into the daily life of the pyramid builders, laborers under the unrelenting sun, working in dangerous conditions, with only modest comforts to sustain them. Then we will turn to one of Egypt's most unusual rulers, Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, who abandoned centuries of tradition in pursuit of a single god. From there, we will step into mystery, the much-whispered curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, separating legend from the quiet truths of science. Finally, we will enter the world of Egypt's royal elite, walking the polished floors of palaces where ritual, luxury, and divine ceremony shaped every moment of life. This is not a tale of spectacle or sensational discovery. It is a slower unfolding, a glimpse at the rhythms, hardships, and curiosities of a civilization that continues to fascinate. So allow yourself to settle, to breathe deeply, and to drift gently into the ancient past. Imagine yourself at the base of a massive construction site more than 4,000 years ago. The sun has already risen high, flooding the plateau with blinding light. The air is dry, and the ground, hardened by countless footsteps, is thick with dust. The pyramid rises slowly, stone by stone, each block weighing several tons. From a distance, the scene may appear orderly, almost majestic. But from within, it is an endless rhythm of labor. You are a worker here. Your day begins not in comfort, but with routine. Before dawn, the overseers stir the camp. The settlement is alive with the noise of men preparing for the day, tying sandals, wrapping linen cloths tightly around their waists, gathering in groups before the long march toward the worksite. Your tools are simple: wooden sledges, ropes of papyrus fiber, copper chisels that dull quickly and must be resharpened, and baskets to carry smaller stones or debris. The work itself is punishing. Teams drag massive limestone blocks along causeways slicked with water or mud to ease the friction. The sledges groan, the ropes cut into calloused hands, and every movement requires coordination. If a block shifts at the wrong moment, it can crush feet, legs, or lives. Injuries are common, and though there are rudimentary healers, a serious accident could end both your labor and your place in the community. The heat presses constantly on your skin. By midday, your linen is soaked with sweat, and the dust clings to every fold. There is little shade. You pause only for water, drawn from large clay jars placed strategically along the site. Water is precious and rationed. Meals are simple, often consisting of bread baked from emmer wheat, perhaps with dried fish or onions, sometimes with a small measure of beer that provides both sustenance and a kind of relief. Despite the hardship, you are not a slave in the strict sense that later ages imagined. The builders were, in many cases, seasonal laborers of farmers who, during the flood season when their fields were underwater, were called to serve the state. Others were full-time workers, housed in purpose-built villages near the pyramids, where archaeologists have uncovered evidence of bakeries, breweries, and even medical facilities. These discoveries remind us that the workers were not invisible. They were part of an organized, living community, though their comfort was minimal by our standards. Yet even with such organization, life was unrelentingly hard. The rhythm of your day is set by the sun and the overseer's voice. Hours stretch into one another. The endless repetition of hauling, cutting, dragging, and placing creates a monotony broken only by exhaustion. The body aches, and the mind dulls. There is a constant undercurrent of danger. The stone ramps, rising higher as the pyramid grows, are steep and precarious. A slip, a broken rope, a moment's miscalculation can send a block crashing down, carrying men with it. Even those who avoid such catastrophes carry the burden of wear, joints inflamed, muscles torn, backs bent from strain. When night falls, you return to the village. There may be a brief sense of relief, of laughter shared over bowls of stew, of conversations about family and home. But rest is short, and dawn comes quickly. You live in a world defined by obligation to the pharaoh, who is believed to be both king and god, and to the community that relies on your labor. Still, there are moments of pride. When you look up at the structure, already towering above the desert, you know it will endure. The stone you place today may stand for millennia. Though your own name will be forgotten, the monument will remain. And in a culture that valued permanence and memory above all else, this is no small comfort. But the cost to you, as an ordinary worker, is undeniable. Endless toil under a merciless sun, meager rations that never quite satisfy hunger, and a body constantly strained. These are the realities of life as a pyramid builder. And foremost, this was not a brief chapter, but the substance of entire years, even lifetimes. Beyond the endless weight of stone and the piercing heat, the daily rhythm of the pyramid worker was punctuated by small, fleeting moments of relief. At midday, the crews were often allowed to pause, retreating into the shade of temporary shelters or the thin shadows cast by scaffolding. There, they would chew on bread that was coarse and filled with grit from the grinding stones, and sip beer that was thick, more like a porridge than the clear drink you may imagine. This beer, humble as it was, provided hydration and calories, and it became the fuel for their return to the slopes of the pyramid in the long afternoon hours. The tools of their labor were as unforgiving as the sun. Copper chisels dulled quickly against the hard limestone, and workers spent as much time sharpening them as they did cutting. Mallets splintered, rope frayed under the strain of hauling multi-ton blocks. Blisters formed on hands, then hardened into calluses, only to split again. And always, there was the dust, the fine, choking dust of quarried stone that clung to skin, filled nostrils, and irritated lungs. Breathing, day after day, was not clean or easy, but heavy with the taste of earth. For some, the danger was sudden and unavoidable. A block slipped from its sledge, crushing feet or pinning a man beneath its weight. Scaffolds collapsed when the lashings failed. A misstep on the pyramid's unfinished face meant tumbling downward, with little hope of survival. Others met their fate slowly, worn away by exhaustion, dehydration, and the endless repetition of labor that left their bodies frail long before their years. And yet, there was pride woven into this hardship. To be chosen as a worker on the king's pyramid was, in a sense, an honor. Families back in their home villages saw these men as part of something larger than themselves, tied to the divine project that would ensure the pharaoh's eternal life. It was said that to serve the king in building his eternal house was to earn favor in the afterlife. Whether the workers truly believed this, or whether it was simply a comfort whispered among them to ease their burdens, is something we can only guess. Their camps, situated near the pyramid sites, tell us much about their lives. Excavations have revealed rows of small mud brick houses, laid out in a grid, each one scarcely large enough for sleeping mats and a cooking hearth. The air within must have been thick with smoke from fires burning dried reeds and dung, mixed with the earthy smell of porridge boiling in clay pots. At night, weary bodies crowded together, drifting into shallow sleep interrupted by snores, coughs, and the shifting of aching limbs. But life was not only labor. In their off hours, workers played simple games with carved stones or knuckle bones, sang songs to lighten their spirits, and told stories of gods, of journeys on the Nile, of home. Some even scratched graffiti into stone blocks, leaving us with fleeting glimpses of their humor and pride. One inscription, preserved across thousands of years, identifies a work crew as the Friends of Khufu, reminding us that even amid hardship, identity and camaraderie gave strength. Even their meals, humble as they were, offer us a connection. Alongside bread and beer, there were sometimes lentils, onions, or dried fish. On rare occasions, beef or goat meat was provided, a luxury that would have been eagerly shared. Imagine the rare joy of biting into tender meat after weeks of nothing but coarse bread, a brief moment of nourishment and delight before the long march of labor resumed. And so the rhythm continued, the creak of ropes, the thud of sledges, the shouted chants of work crews straining in unison to move stone against gravity and time. Morning blended into afternoon, and days blended into years, each block laid upon another, until the pyramid slowly reached toward the sky. For many of these workers, their lives ended long before the project was complete, yet the structures they labored on vast, enduring, and awe-inspiring stand still, bearing silent witness to both their suffering and their perseverance. When you think of pharaohs, you probably imagine towering figures in gold crowns, stern faces carved into temple walls, gods among men who projected strength and permanence. And then there was Akhenaten-born Amenhotep IV, a man who did not just step outside the mold of what a pharaoh was supposed to be, but shattered it entirely. From the beginning of his reign in the 14th century BCE, Akhenaten was unusual. He abandoned the familiar gods of Egypt, the dozens upon dozens of deities that had shaped daily life for millennia, and elevated just one, Aten, the solar disk. This was not simply a matter of personal devotion. It was a religious revolution, one that reached into every corner of Egypt's existence. Temples dedicated to Amen, the chief god of the old order, were closed. The priesthoods that had grown wealthy and powerful were stripped of influence. For the first time, the sprawling pantheon of Egyptian gods was reduced to a singular force, embodied in the life-giving rays of the sun. Akhenaten's choice was radical, but so too was the way he presented himself. Where earlier pharaohs carved images of themselves as muscular, perfect beings, Akhenaten's statues and reliefs showed him with elongated features, a narrow face, wide hips, and a soft, almost androgynous body. To his subjects, this must have been shocking. Was he attempting to portray himself as both man and woman, embodying all of creation, or was this simply a reflection of his true form, leaving behind the idealized images of the past? Scholars still argue, but what is certain is that Akhenaten wanted to be seen as different, and he went further still. Instead of ruling from the ancient, holy city of Thebes, Akhenaten built a brand new capital out of nothing, on the banks of the Nile, in a stretch of desert that had been untouched. He raised the city of Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Palaces, temples, homes, and workshops sprang up in astonishing speed, as if the entire machinery of Egypt's state had been uprooted and replanted in the sands. It was here that Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their daughters lived lives unlike any royal household before them. For the first time in Egyptian art, we see the pharaoh not as a distant god, but as a husband and father. Reliefs show Akhenaten and Nefertiti sitting side by side, their children climbing onto their laps, the rays of the sun disk stretching down to touch their faces. It was a vision of intimacy, of divine family life, utterly foreign to the stiff, formal traditions of earlier kings. But beneath this revolutionary vision, Egypt strained. The priests of Amen, displaced and furious, surely whispered of betrayal. Common people, who had always turned to a multitude of gods for help in sickness, childbirth, or harvest, were now told that only Aten mattered. Whole traditions of prayer and sacrifice were uprooted. And abroad, while Akhenaten focused on his god and his city, Egypt's empire weakened. Vassal states in Syria and Canaan called for aid against invaders, but their pleas often went unanswered. Akhenaten's Egypt was at once a bold new world and a fragile, unstable experiment. He stood at the center of it all, his strange figure bathed in the light of Aten, insisting that this was the only truth. For those who lived under his rule, it must have felt as though the ground beneath them was shifting, that the eternal order of Egypt, the balance of gods and kings, was unraveling. Life in Akhetaten was unlike life anywhere else in Egypt. The city had been built in a rush, its streets and temples erected with speed rather than the timeless solidity of stone monuments like Karnak or Luxor. Many buildings were made with mud brick, meant more to serve Akhenaten's vision than to last for centuries. To the workers and officials who moved there, it must have felt like living in a strange experiment, an entire capital cut off from Egypt's sacred traditions, existing only to serve one god and one king. For the priests of Amen, this was exile. Once accustomed to vast temple complexes filled with worshippers and offerings, they now found themselves stripped of wealth and authority. Whispers of discontent spread quietly, because opposing a pharaoh could mean death, but resentment burned nonetheless. Every shuttered temple to Amen, every ritual that could no longer be performed, widened the divide between Akhenaten's court and the rest of Egypt. And what of the common people? They had always lived with the gods interwoven into their daily lives. A fisherman might pray to Sobek, lord of crocodiles, for protection on the Nile. A mother might leave an offering to Hathor for her child's health. Farmers would honor Osiris, who governed the fertile cycles of death and rebirth in the fields. Now they were told that these gods were no longer valid, that Aten alone mattered, and Aten was far more abstract. How could a mother begging for her child's survival connect to a blazing disk in the sky? For many, this new religion must have felt cold and unreachable. Meanwhile, Akhenaten's devotion to Aten was not just religious, but deeply political. By placing all power into the hands of one god, and by presenting himself as Aten's chosen prophet, he cut away centuries of priestly influence. This was a consolidation of authority on a scale Egypt had rarely seen. Yet it came at a cost. Egypt's neighbors saw weakness. Letters from vassal kings in Syria and Canaan survive to this day, pleading with Akhenaten for troops and supplies as enemy forces pressed in. Time and again, they begged, "Why have you abandoned us?" But Akhenaten rarely answered. His attention was fixed on Aten, on his city, and on reshaping the very foundations of belief. Inside the royal palace, life unfolded in an oddly human way for a divine household. The art from Akhetaten shows daughters playing tug-of-war with their parents' crowns, Nefertiti tenderly holding a child, while Aten's rays touch her face. For Egyptians, who had never before seen their king depicted with such vulnerability, it was disorienting. The pharaoh was no longer a distant god in flesh, but a man in the sunlight with his family. Whether this made Akhenaten appear more relatable or dangerously untraditional is difficult to say, but to his subjects, it was undeniable that their world had changed beyond recognition. And yet, in this dreamlike city in the desert, cracks were already forming. The economy struggled as resources were poured into Akhetaten's construction. The people longed for the comfort of the old gods. Foreign territories slipped further from Egyptian control. While Akhenaten basked in Aten's rays, the wider world darkened around him. The seeds of collapse had already been planted, and when his reign ended, they would grow into chaos. While kings like Akhenaten reshaped religion and commanded cities into existence, another class of Egyptians quietly held the keys to power, knowledge, and memory itself, the scribes. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was to belong to a privileged minority. In a world where the vast majority of people labored in the fields or on construction projects, the ability to read and write was a gateway to authority, wealth, and permanence. The training began young. A boy chosen for scribal education would spend years hunched over reed pens and tablets copying characters again and again until his hand obeyed the precision demanded by hieroglyphs. Mistakes were not tolerated. Egyptian writing was not just functional but sacred, believed to carry divine energy in every stroke. To miswrite a name was more than an error. It could mean the erasure of a soul's place in eternity. The weight of this responsibility pressed on the young student as heavily as any physical labor. Their curriculum was rigorous. Students copied wisdom texts, proverbs, and instructions, often filled with moral lessons meant to shape not only their writing but their character. They were taught to respect authority, to embrace discipline, and to understand the sacred role they would play in maintaining Egypt's order. While a farmer broke his back in the heat of the sun, a scribe's work was quieter but no less demanding. Mental endurance rather than physical. Once trained, a scribe could serve in a variety of roles. Some worked in temple complexes, recording offerings, rituals, and oracles. Others found themselves in government offices, tallying taxes, managing labor forces, or keeping census records. Every shipment of grain, every conscription of workers, every decree of the pharaoh passed through a scribe's hand. Without them, Egypt's vast bureaucracy would grind to a halt. In essence, they were the glue that held the kingdom together. Yet the life of a scribe was not all dry accounting. Many were deeply involved in storytelling, preserving myths, prayers, and hymns. Others recorded legal disputes, trials, and even private letters between officials. Through their ink, the voices of people long dead continue to speak across thousands of years. Without scribes, Akhenaten's letters to foreign kings, the hymns to Aten, or the wisdom texts of the Old Kingdom might have been lost forever. The scribes' elevated position also meant they often lived comfortably compared to laborers. They enjoyed privileges, better housing, less brutal work, and higher social standing. In fact, many ancient Egyptian texts survive where scribes proudly mocked the hardships of farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen, reminding students that their path spared them such suffering. A famous text, the Satire of the Trades, makes clear just how desirable scribal life was. But their position was not without challenges. They bore the pressure of accuracy, the expectation of loyalty to the state, and the constant awareness that their words could shape legacies. A misplaced record could alter tax burdens for hundreds. A poorly copied ritual could anger the gods. And beyond their lifetimes, scribes often carried the burden of history's judgment. When later rulers sought to erase the memory of a predecessor, as they did with Akhenaten, it was scribes who carried out the chiseling away of names, the rewriting of records, the reshaping of history itself. Thus, the scribes stood at the intersection of power, memory, and eternity. They were servants to kings, priests, and gods alike, yet they wielded influence more enduring than swords or monuments. In the quiet scratching of their pens, they preserved Egypt's story, and sometimes they rewrote it. For the average Egyptian, the life of a scribe must have seemed almost mystical. Imagine being a farmer, toiling in the fields beneath the punishing sun, hands cracked and raw from harvesting barley, sweat stinging your eyes as you labored hour after hour. From your perspective, the scribe sat in the shade, reed pen in hand, dipping into a smooth palette of black and red ink, his linen clothing clean and crisp, his hands unstained by dirt. He spoke directly to officials, priests, even nobles. He ate better, lived longer, and his work carried him into cool offices instead of blistering quarries. This privilege was no accident. The state invested heavily in scribes because they were indispensable. They were the nervous system of Egypt, carrying messages between the organs of the state, ensuring that every limb of the kingdom moved in harmony. Grain collected from one province, workers assigned to another, armies dispatched to distant borders all required the careful records and instructions scribes provided. Their training was, therefore, not just academic but practical, for the scribe had to understand not only symbols on papyrus, but the systems of trade, taxation, and ritual life those symbols represented. A scribe's toolkit was deceptively simple: a flat wooden palette with two wells for ink, black for standard writing, red for emphasis, or headings, a bundle of reed pens, and rolls of papyrus. Yet with these modest tools, they could craft documents that outlived entire dynasties. Even today, thousands of years later, We can unroll papyrus sheets and read the words of scribes whose names have long since faded, but whose handwriting preserves contracts, prayers, poetry, and laws. One of the most fascinating aspects of their work was the creation of funerary texts, especially what we now call the Book of the Dead. This was not a single book, but a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions intended to guide the soul through the afterlife. Scribes had to copy them with precision, for an error could mean the difference between eternal bliss and annihilation in the underworld. Think of the pressure your pen strokes determining whether a person's soul could pass Osiris' judgment or be devoured by Ammit, the monstrous eater of the dead. But scribes were not always solemn or dry. Some were also storytellers, preserving Egypt's rich tradition of narrative literature. Tales like the story of Sinner, in which a court official flees Egypt only to return decades later, or the shipwrecked sailor, with its fantastical island ruled by a giant serpent, remind us that scribes were human beings who delighted in drama, humor, and imagination. These works were read aloud, entertaining audiences and teaching moral lessons. It was scribes who ensured that Egyptians had not only records of taxes and laws, but also stories to laugh at, cry over, and ponder late into the night. There was also a competitive, almost boastful pride among scribes. In their writings, they often extolled their profession above all others. A soldier might die young, scarred from battle. A carpenter would strain his muscles to exhaustion. A farmer's back would bend until it broke. But the scribe, they declared, lived in comfort, respected by all. In a society that valued hierarchy and order, such writings were not just arrogance but recruitment, designed to persuade ambitious youths or their parents that the life of a scribe was the path to dignity and influence. And yet, beneath this pride, there was danger. To be a scribe was also to carry immense responsibility. Mistakes could cost lives, wealth, or even dynastic stability. If a grain shipment failed to arrive at a garrison, if a tax record was miscalculated, if a treaty was mistranslated, the consequences were far-reaching. In this sense, scribes walked a fine line, privileged, yes, but also burdened with the knowledge that their words carried the weight of kings. Beyond the pragmatic, scribes also shaped memory itself. When later pharaohs sought to erase a rival from history, such as Akhenaten, scribes were the ones who carefully chiseled names from monuments, who recopied documents with altered lines, who rewrote history as instructed. In doing so, they wielded an invisible power to determine what would survive and what would vanish. For all of Egypt's stone monuments, the pen of the scribe was equally eternal. Some scribes rose even higher, becoming officials, overseers, or even viziers, the highest office under the pharaoh. From humble beginnings as students, they could climb to positions where they influenced the direction of the entire kingdom. Their mastery of words opened doors that were closed to almost everyone else. And so, when we think of ancient Egypt, with its pyramids, temples, and castle statues, we must remember the scribes, those quiet figures with reed pens in hand. They were not the ones who lifted the stones, nor the ones who stood in gilded crowns, but they were the ones who gave permanence to both. Without them, the voice of Egypt might have fallen silent thousands of years ago. And while the scribes recorded the words of kings, laws, and stories, they also preserved something perhaps even more vital, the knowledge of life and death itself. For it was through the reed pens of scribes that Egypt's medical wisdom was written down. Spells, remedies, diagnoses, and surgical instructions that tell us how the ancients grappled with sickness and health. To step into the world of ancient Egyptian medicine is to enter a place where magic and science were inseparable. Imagine walking into a small chamber within a temple, the smell of incense thick in the air, jars of herbs lined neatly on shelves, papyrus scrolls carefully stored in niches, and beside them, small figurines of gods. Here, the physician, often a priest or a learned scribe, stood at the crossroads of religion and healing, treating both body and spirit. The Egyptians believed that disease could come from natural causes, such as injuries, parasites, or spoiled food, but also from supernatural forces, curses, angry spirits, or displeased gods. This dual view of illness meant that healing was never just about herbs or bandages. It was also about prayers, spells, and rituals. A treatment might include both applying honey to a wound, since honey's antiseptic qualities were well known, and reciting an incantation to drive out malevolent forces. The evidence of their practices survives in medical papyri, the most famous being the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, over 100 pages long. It contains hundreds of remedies and instructions, from treating stomach pain with herbal mixtures to diagnosing pregnancy by observing changes in a woman's body. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, meanwhile, stands out as perhaps the oldest known surgical text in the world. Unlike the magical incantations found elsewhere, it provides rational, methodical descriptions of injuries and how to treat them, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, even recognizing untreatable head trauma. Its tone feels surprisingly modern, almost clinical, showing us that Egyptian medicine could be deeply practical. The doctors themselves were respected specialists. Some were attached to temples, serving both gods and patients. Others worked in the royal court, tending to pharaohs and nobles. There were even medical specialists with specific titles: eye doctors, stomach doctors, shepherds of the anus, proctologists, and dentists. In fact, one inscription calls Amanid Hefesira the greatest of physicians and dentists, as early as 2600 BCE. This shows that even in antiquity, Egyptians understood the need for specialized care. Treatments could be surprisingly effective. Honey and resin were applied to wounds to prevent infection. Castor oil was used as a laxative. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the basis of modern aspirin, was prescribed for pain relief. Garlic and onions were believed to strengthen the body, and beer, a staple of the Egyptian diet, was sometimes used in medicinal recipes. Yet alongside these practical remedies, there were also treatments that seem bizarre today: crocodile dung for contraception, or magical amulets to ward off fevers. But we shouldn't dismiss the magical side too quickly. For the Egyptians, health was not just a matter of the body. It was about balance between gods and humans, chaos and order, life and death. A fever could be the result of a curse. A lingering illness might mean the soul had been disturbed. Healing rituals were meant to restore this harmony, often invoking gods like Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and healing, or Thoth, the god of wisdom. In this sense, Egyptian medicine was holistic, addressing both the seen and unseen causes of disease. And sometimes, their care extended beyond life itself. Mummification, after all, was a kind of medical practice, an attempt to preserve the body so that the soul could recognize it in the afterlife. The embalmers were not simply undertakers, they were technicians of flesh, carefully removing organs, treating the body with resins and natron, and wrapping it in linen with surgical precision. Their work reflected the Egyptian belief that health and wholeness were eternal concerns, stretching even into death. So, in the shadow of the temples, and within the pages of papyri, Egyptian medicine flourished, a blend of observation and incantation, of sharp-eyed diagnosis and whispered prayer. It was imperfect, sometimes strange, yet astonishingly advanced for its time. When we look closer at Egyptian medical knowledge, we see that it was not only diverse, but also highly organized. Diseases and injuries were often classified, and physicians followed an approach that mixed empirical testing with ritualistic elements. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, for example, reveals a fascinating diagnostic structure. After describing an injury, the physician was instructed to categorize the case into one of three outcomes: a condition I can treat, a condition I will contend with, or a condition for which nothing can be done. This stark honesty shows that Egyptians recognized the limits of their medicine, an astonishingly rational approach for an age when many cultures explained nearly everything through supernatural causes. Take, for instance, the treatment of fractures. The papyri describe how splints made of wooden sticks padded with linen were used to immobilize broken bones. Honey and grease were applied to wounds before bandaging to prevent infection and aid healing. Archaeological remains confirm the success of these methods. Skeletons have been found with well-healed fractures, evidence that patients often survive serious injuries thanks to careful treatment. Childbirth, however, was far more dangerous. Women relied on both midwives and protective rituals to ensure safe delivery. Magical figurines, such as ivory ones carved with protective deities, like Taurith, the hippo goddess of fertility, were often placed near mothers in labor. Remedies for easing pain in childbirth included mixtures of honey, herbs, and even dates, sometimes combined with incantations. Still, high infant and maternal mortality rates plagued ancient Egypt, as in much of the ancient world. Another area of Egyptian medicine was dentistry, a field in which they struggled more. Although Hesira was hailed as an early chief dentist, dental remains show severe tooth wear, abscesses, and decay. This was largely due to the gritty nature of Egyptian bread, which contained sand and stone particles from grinding flour on rough stone mills. Remedies included rinses made from natron and natural salt, and herbal poultices to dull the pain. However, there is little evidence that Egyptians developed advanced methods of repairing cavities or replacing teeth. Many people suffered lifelong toothaches, and some even died from infections spreading from untreated abscesses. Parasites were another constant menace. The hot climate and irrigation-based farming system made the Egyptians vulnerable to schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease from waterborne snails, malaria, and intestinal worms. Medical texts describe remedies for stomach pain, often recommending beer mixed with medicinal herbs, or garlic believed to have antiparasitic qualities. Even so, autopsies on mummies have revealed evidence of parasitic infections, showing that these illnesses were never fully conquered. Yet despite these struggles, Egyptian medicine contained glimpses of brilliance. Surgical procedures such as draining abscesses, stitching wounds, and treating dislocated joints were recorded with a clarity that foreshadows modern medical handbooks. Linen bandages, carefully applied with resins, often acted like antiseptics and provided a surprisingly effective treatment. The use of moldy bread to dress wounds, noted in some sources, may have even provided an accidental dose of penicillin-like substances centuries before antibiotics were discovered. Religious healing was equally powerful. Temples dedicated to Imhotep, the architect priest who became deified as a god of medicine, functioned as centers for both worship and healing. Pilgrims seeking cures would sleep in temple precincts, hoping for dreams or visions in which the god revealed a remedy. Priests and doctors worked hand in hand, prescribing both practical treatments and spiritual rituals, reinforcing the Egyptian view that health was tied to cosmic balance, not merely the body's condition. The legacy of these practices is evident in how widely Egyptian medical knowledge traveled. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen were influenced by Egyptian methods, often referring to earlier writings preserved in Alexandria. In this sense, Egypt became one of the oldest medical classrooms for the ancient world, passing its knowledge along to civilizations that followed. And beyond the technical details, there is something profoundly human in their attempts. Whether through honey and willow bark, or through prayers to Sekhmet and Thoth, Egyptian medicine reflects the eternal struggle of people to fight suffering, to save loved ones, and to make sense of illness in a world where life was fragile and death ever present. When we step back and take in the vast sweep of ancient Egypt, it becomes clear that this civilization was not merely about pyramids, mummies, and golden tombs, but about people ordinary and extraordinary, living within a delicate balance of survival, belief, and ambition. From the grand experiments of pharaohs like Akhenaten to the quiet endurance of farmers along the Nile, from the meticulous scribes who preserved the state's lifeblood on papyrus scrolls to the physicians who sought to mend broken bodies with herbs and ritual. The story of Egypt is, above all, a story of human resilience. What makes ancient Egypt so captivating is not just its monumental achievements, but the way its people confronted the same challenges we still wrestle with today: disease, inequality, war, questions of faith, and the desire to leave a legacy that will outlast us. Their solutions were a mixture of brilliance and imperfection, of practical knowledge and mystical thinking, reminding us that human progress is never linear, but woven from experimentation, tradition, and the hope that tomorrow might be better than today. The entrance of Egyptian civilization for over 3,000 years is, in itself, a staggering fact. Empires rise and fall in centuries, yet Egypt persisted, adapting to foreign invaders, shifting dynasties, and changing climates, all while retaining a unique cultural identity. That longevity is perhaps the greatest testament to their success. They built a world so enduring that echoes of it still shape ours. From architecture to medicine, from literature to religion, the foundations laid on the banks of the Nile continue to ripple outward. And perhaps this is the final lesson. While the grandeur of pharaohs and temples captures the imagination, it was the collective effort of millions of unnamed farmers, artisans, midwives, and healers that truly sustained Egypt. It was their sweat, their fears, their small victories, and their enduring belief in Mat, the principle of balance and order that held this world together. In the end, the greatness of ancient Egypt rests not only in stone monuments, but in the shared humanity of those who lived beneath their shadow. To study ancient Egypt is not simply to look backward into a vanished age. It is to hold up a mirror to ourselves. We see in them our own struggles with power and belief, with love and mortality, with the need to create, and the inevitability of decay. And just as they sought immortality through tombs and texts, so today we seek it in our own ways. In remembering them, we ensure that their quest was not in vain. The sands of the Nile have buried much, but the voices of Egypt still whisper, through papyri, through bones, through the colossal statues, gazing eternally into the horizon. They remind us that civilizations are fragile, yet ideas endure. And as long as their story is told, ancient Egypt lives on,